Of course, Rachel. We say we're going to step away just for a week, reset our palates, get ready. And so much news in the PWHL breaks. Erica L. Ayala here alongside Rachel Donner. You're listening to At Even Strength, the women's hockey podcast for Black Rosie Media. And we're going to get right into it, Rachel. We are going to talk protected players in phase one. We've broken that down in previous episodes. We're going to talk about the players and disclosure of salaries, but with an asterisk. We have something that we want to address when it comes to that. And, there's also been some personnel changes that have been announced. And how does that fit into what we know is going to be quite a stretch here in the next week as we go through the expansion process, all leading right to Detroit for the draft. Rachel, we're going to get into it here. Earlier in the week, we got the list of protected players in the player distribution process. A little bit of that was explained. And then we have the player protections for phase one. This news dropped on June 3rd. 3 players from each team. And we're going to put them up on the screen. We'll go through them here. So anyone who is not watching along will be able to share this. But let's start with the protected players from each team, and then what we think this list means when it comes to the future of these players and the teams. So the Boston Fleet, Rachel, they go with Aaron Frankel, Megan Keller, and Haley Wynn. Minnesota, Taylor Heisey, Kelly Panic, and Maddie Rooney. The Montreal Victoire, the champions, who got a shout out from Celine Dion. Let's go. That was awesome. The Montreal Victoire protect, death taxes, right? And Renee Debian, Marie-Philippe Poulin, and Laura Stacy. The New York Sirens, they protect Sarah Fillier, Christina Koltenkova, and Casey O'Brien. The Ottawa Charge go with Rebecca Leslie, Gwyneth Phillips, and Rania Salvalainen. The Seattle Torrent go with Alex Carpenter, Hannah Murphy, and Anna Wilgren. The Toronto Scepters, they protect Renata Foss. There were some murmurs that maybe she was shopping around. We've heard a little bit of confirmation on other players that have been shopping as well. We'll get into that. But Renata Foss does stay with Toronto. Reagan Kirk and Ella Shelton will also return and have been protected. The Vancouver Golden Eyes, they protect Sophie Jakes, Emrance Mashmeyer, and Sarah Nurse. Now, when you look at this list overall, Rachel, what are some trends you're seeing? Are there any big surprises that stand out to you?
Yeah, so when the list first came out, I think for me, the 2 biggest surprises, and there had been rumors about Seattle not protecting Hilary Knight, but it was still a surprise, whether you heard about it before the official list came out or when the official list came out. I think it feels that way, not from a necessarily hockey perspective, because I can see from a hockey perspective why they might not have done that.
Yeah.
But just from the fact that she's a foundational player that left her longtime home of Boston, like you really, I know she's like a Wisconsin girl, but from Idaho, I understand that. But when you think about Hilary Knight and her pro hockey career, it's just Boston, and that's all you think of, right? To have her uproot that and move to Seattle, for them to not protect her and the brand aspect of it was the most surprising part of it for me.
For sure. And you know what? Let's stick with Seattle because, we did get to hear from all of the GMs and, we'll intersperse some of what their quotes were, the biggest takeaways from each team as we go through this. So you'll hear the snippets at times. But, I think from hearing from Meghan Turner, Meghan Turner is really good at the sports business speak. And it's not that nothing was said, but it's definitely not more than she wanted to share. She's really good at that. What I did kind of glean from the entire conversation with Meghan Turner is that this might have been something that was about balancing the salary cap and figuring out if there are specific players, because Kayla Barnes also not protected as another example. Protecting certain players for kind of not only, but for a big part in what they bring as far as a draw to the organization versus being able to have players that on the ice can give you that for perhaps a longer period of time, whether it's because they're more committed to Seattle or they just have a more of their career ahead of them than a player like a Hilary Knight or even a Kayla Barnes. I think to me it sounded like. So what I do think is interesting when it comes to the Seattle Torrent is that from what we heard from Meghan Turner, I think that they are about prioritizing a young core for this Torrent team.
Yeah.
And building through that, especially Rachel knowing that they're going to have a new head coach. I think they leaned into that more than maybe some of the gravitational pull of the superstars that they had on the roster in season 1.
Yeah, and that's why I say from a hockey perspective, I get it. I just think it's still interesting given the force that she is and, everything that they built around her for this expansion process, for their own expansion process, right?
Yeah.
So that was the interesting part.
Yeah, 100%. I think sticking with the Torrent, I've been kind of keeping eyes on goaltending. And I'm not completely surprised that they went with Hannah Murphy. The playing time suggested that the team was going to lean into Murphy more than Corrine Schroeder. I don't think that it was I think that a little bit more of an equitable split would have been understandable and dare I even say preferable for how Seattle competed. I don't think it was a Corrine Schroeder issue, I guess is another way of saying it. And it did kind of seem like the writing was on the wall. Now, what's interesting is, at first you think, oh, maybe that had to do with coaching because there was a coaching change. They move on from O'Rourke, but it seems like maybe they also moved on from Corrine Schroeder. The tough thing is that unlike some of the other teams with Seattle, again, Meghan doesn't say more than she wants to. She never let on, and nor do I recall that she was directly asked. I watched, on replay here. I don't believe she was ever directly asked about players other than Hilary Knight and Kayla Barnes, why they weren't protected. And if they tried, if there was an attempt there, it was just like, there was a conversation that was had. It's a respectful conversation, but the details on whether it was a player maybe not getting a number that they wanted or the team telling the player that they weren't going to make an offer, that kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, who knows with all of this going on behind the scenes, but I think that obviously these were all very difficult decisions and only getting 3 protection slots this early in the process is really tough. I know they get, more of them down the road as we get later in the phases and, we'll see what happens in this phase 2 with the foundational signings that the expansion teams can put forth, but tough decisions. And I think there's going to be a lot of hindsight second guessing here after phase 2.
And I hate to do it to you, Toronto, but I'm gonna, because one of the teams I think that you wanted a chance to kind of talk about how not just the moves that they made and some more detail that we got about moves that they weren't able to make, but also the fact that in very close proximity, they have an expansion team that they're going to have to contend with. I think Toronto, for you, Rachel, it sounds like was an organization that you really are having, at least from early returns, some questions that need to be answered pretty quickly when it comes to them.
Yeah, I think so. And obviously what we heard or have to read between the lines about Daryl Watts does not bode well, right? That they tried to come to an agreement and couldn't. And obviously Daryl Watts had high expectations for herself in this process and stuck to it. And, didn't just sign for the sake of signing here and was certainly, putting herself first, it seems like, in this process. And so that led to her not being signed there. And, they had already signed and protected Renata Fast in this process. But to me, I did not have Reagan Kirk on my protected list. I thought that even though I think generally protecting a goalie in this part of it is the right philosophy, I thought for Toronto, I thought that she's very good. Don't get me wrong, but I found that I think given the way that team is, she's replaceable ultimately, and they didn't need that spot for her. I really thought it was going to be Daryl Watson, Blair Turnbull in those two slots.
Yeah.
But it was not. And so we got Ella Shelton in the other spot. And I think Toronto has a marked disadvantage in this process with an expansion team just down the road. So anybody who wants to play quote unquote in Toronto has another option there with a head coach that just did a real good job in Boston, who laterally moved up to Hamilton.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think Toronto is at the biggest disadvantage in this entire process.
Yeah, that's tough. And like you said, just to bring this back to a news point, because again, we took a little bit of time off, but Chris Spar, he is the new head coach in Hamilton. So moving on, and Boston also has already moved on. They hired a new head coach. But in hearing Boston speak and throughout some of their press conference, I mean, the obvious question was asked. I mean, this is 3 different head coaches going into season 4. And, I think with Boston, it was interesting to kind of hear the organization speak about the coaching or the process to hire the new head coach, given that they had experience hiring head coaches. So it's Francois Mathot, who was up in Rochester, working there with the junior Americans of the North American Hockey League, the NAHL. And, Francois has some experience and has come across players, Hayley Wynn in particular, which I think Boston fans will see as a plus, and is familiar with Hayley Wynn's game. But this is not necessarily, I'll say it this way: the immediate skill set and where this coach Francois has been focused on is it's more specific than like a head coach or even an assistant coaching role, Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, it is, until proven otherwise, it's a question mark to me. And, I'm not saying the thought can't do it. I'm just saying, I don't know. Until I see it, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, was at the Junior Americans also serving a dual role, which I'm not a big fan of these dual roles in hockey specifically, but was the GM and head coach there, but has, like a development background, like training development, player development, things like that. So I think Boston, it's what does this coaching change put you in at least the position that Chris left off with, or even better, right? So what does that look like? Getting a team that's a top 2 team throughout the regular season. They're competing and able to secure a top 2 spot. Getting a team that, of course, then if they can do that, they're making the playoffs. But then the next task for this Boston team, which again, we have to see what the roster looks like. But if we were only to assume based off of what they had last year, Rachel, you have to think that this is a Boston team, if they can keep some significant pieces together, that is not only going to want to, but can absolutely push to be a contender when they protected Aaron Frankel, Meghan Keller, and Hayley Wynn.
Yeah, it does seem weird on its face to protect a goalie and 2 defenders, right? But I still think that was the right call. That was absolutely the right call, because that is their core. And I feel like there's going to be opportunities to get scorers. And they were so good in terms of distributing their offense on their team, because this was a team game. This wasn't like superstar land other than Frankel. I mean, Meghan Keller, you can argue, but I think that this, in terms of scoring, was more distributed. And so I feel strongly that this was still the right move, despite it on its face maybe not looking like it.
I agree with you 100%. I think because of how the team played and some of the players that they have, I think they are hedging their bets in other areas. Jesse Eldridge comes to mind for me.
Right.
Now,
right.
is it
She's a strong number 4 on my list.
Right. Like, is it fair? Is it right? Is it whatever word you want to use that she's not protected? You can definitely make that argument, because Jesse Eldridge is showing that she especially was a good fit in Boston. That being said, knowing that you have another chance at her, I think you take that chance that she's still, unfortunately, under the radar. Unfortunate for Jessie herself, but maybe fortunate if you're Boston. Like, how many people?
Or maybe fortunate for Jessie in the end. Who knows?
Who knows?
We'll find out.
Who knows? I mean, yeah, who knows? I think she's a great fit for a Boston team that, I think it's such a great fit. And I think, I guess maybe I'm showing my hand here, right? I hope Jessie stays in Boston. I just think that was a really solid fit for her, and I look forward to seeing what she can do with some of the players that we know are protected and others that are likely to return with that roster. Okay, so Boston gets a new coach, but we still are coachless in Seattle for now, but they're not the only expansion team of the last season, that being season 3, who is without their head coach. We're kind of mixing and matching all of our news because, again, so much happened while we were away, Rachel. But Brian Nadolski will not return to the Vancouver Golden Eyes. Now, there's always this debate, I think, when it comes to coaching roles, period. But we talked about this before in the PWHL. When you have a new expansion / free agency process and you have an entry draft a week away, what is the value added in having that coach before you go or before you complete that process, as opposed to working hard to make your roster perhaps the selling point and then find a coach that fits that roster and the vision of what's possible? I mean, that kind of feels like the latter, kind of feels like what Karamari is trying to do in Vancouver, because she said, don't worry about it, sweetheart. We don't have a head coach. Don't worry about it. We're focusing on building our roster.
Right. And the culture comes from the locker room, right? I think, and she has emphasized wanting to build a particular culture like this whole time since day one. So I don't think with Vancouver, like, I'm not worried about that. I think, with Seattle, I'm a little bit more worried about it. Toronto, I'm a lot worried about it. But Vancouver, I'm not, because I feel like the people that want to be there will want to be there, and they'll have a culture and they'll find the right coach to fit it. And especially given the fact that Kara Mori is a coach at heart, like, she understands the ins and outs of it better than I think a lot of people do, Troy Ryan notwithstanding. But I feel like she's the right person to do this scenario with.
Yeah, 100%. Listen, it didn't go over as well as I would have hoped for Kara in her first year. But, I've said from the beginning when we learned that she would take on this role that I'm a huge fan of how she approaches the game. I just have always been impressed with how she handles things. So that was where the surprise for Vancouver came in, because you're right. She mentioned it again in her most recent press conference that they're going to do the same thing that they did last year. They're going to focus on that character. I thought, speaking of character, she in a different way, it kind of has that Meghan Turner thing to her where she's not going to say more than she wants to. And she does it in it's straightforward. It's usually positive, and it's like brief, bright, fun, and done. She mentioned, hey, Brian's a good friend of mine. It just didn't work out. It just didn't work out. It wasn't the right fit. And that was all she said. And what else do you, I mean, she said what she said. And so I think that's really interesting, because there were some people who noted, Rachel, that when the announcement came, a few things happened. Are they related? I don't know. But how much do you read into, especially when players are liking or reacting to news that their most recent coach is no longer their coach? Is it fair to do that on social media, Rachel? Like, what is the vibe there, do you think? What's the etiquette?
I mean, it doesn't feel fair, but it's kind of how things work these days. So I'm not too mad about it. I mean, I wish it was different? Yes. Is it kind of typical for sports across the board? Also, yes.
Right. So for those who don't maybe know what we're talking about, Sarah Nurse, people noted, liked the post of the Vancouver Golden Eyes announcing that they would be moving on from Brian Nadolski. What people also noticed is that as the kind of deadline worked, right? Just a couple of days after that, she was announced as returning to Vancouver and being a protected player. So I think people were kind of like, oh, okay, the announcement of moving on from a coach, does that have anything to do with the pending window to protect certain players and maybe wanting to prioritize those players? I will say it this way, Rachel. We haven't heard anything from the organization or the players to me that signals that one thing led to another. I'm not saying that's not what happened, but I don't think we have anyone on the record alluding to that in any way, shape, or form.
Right. And I feel like you can draw a dotted line between those two things, but you can't fill it in. That's
Right.
kind of where we are.
Exactly.
But also, that being said, I think they protected the correct 3 players on that team.
Yeah, I mean, Nursey, yeah, 100%. I, she dealt with some injuries that were unfortunate, and it's your leadership core right there. Emrance Mashmeyer, Kara again was really straightforward. We brought her in to be our starting netminder. We want to keep her as our starting netminder. Of course, she made it explicitly clear that if they could keep their their group of goaltenders together, that they would. She was limited to what she could pick. She saw value in picking one player from every position. And again, Emrance has always been the vision of their starter, so they weren't really going to move on from that. She gave her information. She answered the question. She kept it moving. I don't really think it's controversial that Emrance Mashmeyer, even regardless if she was maybe more open to picking 3 players in general, as opposed to 1 forward, 1 goaltender, and 1 defender, I still think Emrance Mashmeyer is top 3. Either way, Kara decided to go about picking those players. And then, I think the most quote unquote controversy for some people is why you go Jakes here. I don't know. What are your thoughts there?
I just think that Sophie Jakes brought something like the correct vibe and culture to this team, along with being a tremendously talented hockey player. Yeah. And I think that if you're also keeping Nurse and Mashmeyer, Sophie Jakes is the logical one. I think you can make arguments for other players, sure.
Yeah.
But I'm just not mad about it. I think it was the right decision.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, again, you can really split hairs here if you want to. You look at Gardner, right?
Gardner is the obvious other choice, right?
Right. And again, a player that Kara said, of course, is someone that we want to keep. This is a tough decision. We made the decision. We communicated the decision, but we hope to get our group back together. I think she's like saying all of the right things and in the right way, where it's like, what else is there? There's not much more that you can ask at this phase to try to poke holes, or at least in a way that she's likely to answer. I mean, you can always continue to go. I just don't know that we're going to see too many teams show their cards, at least not intentionally at this phase, because of how things are looking.
So does that bring us to the New York Sirens? Because I feel like it does.
I think it does. Oh, I think it does. Now, noticeably different in that they did not go 1 per position.
3 forwards.
Okay.
3 forwards.
So, let's get into it. What does this say? What do you think, if anything, it says about what they're trying to do here?
Yeah, it's interesting. So they had to, much like Toronto had to have 2 sign and protects, right? The Sirens had to do that for 2 player, for Casey O'Brien, right? Was the only qualifying offer in this entire phase one process here. And that was one of our biggest questions about this roster at the end of the season was what were they going to do with Casey O'Brien here, and what were they going to go the extra mile for her here? And given kind of the ups and downs of her season and the fact that it took her a hot second to get her scoring touch, right? Mm-hmm. I think that Sarah Fillier was obvious. I think Casey O'Brien was also obvious if they made that decision that the latter half of the season, Casey O'Brien was the Casey O'Brien that we were getting, right? Mm-hmm. The interesting part to me was 3 forwards, and Kristina Kaltenkova was the third one, and not the goaltender. And nothing against Kalty, like, she's a tremendous hockey player here, but injuries, like, you just still kind of don't know what you're getting here with Kalty. Whereas with Kaylee Osborne, you put the entire season of the New York Sirens on the back of Kaylee Osborne. And in fact, in some ways, put too much on her. She came through for you in almost every way conceivable, even though they didn't make the playoffs. That's on scoring, right? And they kept 3 forwards who are responsible for scoring and not the goaltender that got you within the ballpark to begin with.
And that's where Rachel, right? I feel like we kind of have to go back to, okay, this is phase 1. Mm-hmm. Phase 2, the players that are available, right, for mm-hmm. the expansion teams to pick. As we were getting these general manager media availabilities, that list had not come out. I believe it was Kara Mori, who I'm thinking of, and I might have missed if another general manager specifically mentioned it. But my understanding from what we heard from Kara is that that list was coming through later in the day. And it was her understanding that she would know which of her players were going to be eligible for being picked, but not necessarily players that were available across the league. Now, why does that matter? Well, because, right, some of these players that opted either or couldn't get a deal done, right? We're thinking Daryl Watts here, maybe some other players, but those players then are like, when do they get selected here in this field, specific when it comes to expansion, and also with this salary transparency, which we'll get into in a little bit. Like, what is now the value of the players that are available to these expansion teams? Are they going to go with the X's and O's of hockey, or with some pretty heavy hitting names? Do they try to maximize bringing in eyes, and you take what you get on the hockey side? Because again, Hilary Knight, even if the marketing side is the bigger pull here, is no slouch when it comes to hockey.
Right. And I think that's going to be really interesting. And I think, when it comes to goaltenders in particular, this expansion is going to test the overall strength of the league when it comes to goaltending, because we have heard this time and time again. The mantra has been, this league has elite goaltenders and that are impossible to score on. I mean, obviously not impossible, but very, very difficult to score on, and scoring will go up with expansion, right? And so putting a premium on goaltending, now that there's 12 teams, and there's like 24 primary and an additional 12 secondary slots here, like, that's a lot of slots to fill for goaltending. And so it's going to spread things a little thin. And so getting one of those top 6 goaltenders in a 12-team league is going to mean a lot more now. Huge. And to me, Kaylee Osborne is one of those 6.
I would agree with you. And so if you're not guaranteeing yourself when you had the opportunity to get one of those 6 slots, what are you seeing as? Do you either have someone in mind where you feel it's a strong potential that you're going to get them? Do you have a move with a team in mind? I mean, because listen, New York has done some things, right? On draft day, they gave us all of the drama last year, and it just is like, what are they kind of betting on here, Rachel, you know, like, or who maybe are they betting on? I don't know. And I think, at least right now, my answer is that they will get a goaltender that it can stop goals, of course, right? Because there is elite level goaltending. Are they looking on the brick wall, stand on your head, win us tight games goaltender? Maybe not, because they want to maximize the ability to score against those kinds of goaltenders with, you know, really boosting what they have as far as firepower in the forward position.
Right. And the other interesting aspect of this for the Sirens in particular is, you know, if you think that Pascal Daou is playing, you know, 3D chess here, you could say that, well, if Kaylee Osborne goes in this expansion process, they've got that 3rd overall draft pick. And would they, under the right circumstances, pick somebody like Andrea Brandley from the Swiss team who's available and go that route?
You see?
Possible. And that's not a bad strategy. If scoring was your problem, you're prioritizing scoring in this process. And then after phase 2, right, you just try and put it together the best you can and keep as many players as you can that you want and supplement, and then go that route for your top goaltender. I think that's a valid strategy. I don't know that it's a successful strategy, but I think it's a valid strategy.
Right. And that's what I think we have seen from Pascal. The first season, he confused me. I didn't understand some of the decision making there. I think I chalk it up to now hearing him speak and, you know, having a little bit more of an understanding, and having 3 seasons now completely under the belt. I do think that there's a little bit of like mad scientist in him. I do think he likes to tinker around and really gamble in some interesting ways. I think that he likes the excitement of doing that, and not in a way that only is about marketing, but it's like, this will be marketable if we pull it off, right? That's the fancy schmancy, that dance that he likes doing. He's like, you're going to call me crazy. We'll take that heat and then watch what we get to do. And without some significant injuries, and even with them, I do think you started to see, right, the mad scientist, the plans start to really lay out before our eyes.
Yeah, they got to fix that power play. And right. And so
get healthy.
Exactly. And maybe they're banking on Taylor Gerard's injury being a thing that will make other teams less likely to sign her. They'll keep Taylor Gerard. She's probably number 4 or 5. You're correct. On the Sirens list. If you can keep that aspect of the band together, supplement your blue line, because I think they need that help a little bit too. But then also like get your goaltender through the draft. If Osborne gets poached, there's something to that. I don't know what that something is, but there's something to that.
Right? It's like, what is that quote from Willy Wonka where it's like, this is terrible, I want more of it. Or something like that, something to that. I can't remember the exact line, but it's a meme out there in the interwebs somewhere. But that's kind of how it feels.
Right.
So just hold on to your hats, folks. Again, we only have a
Gird your loins.
Gird your loins. That's another good one. Yes, that's also apropos when it comes to Pascal. I think it is a part of the equation and calculations for that mad scientist Pascal. And we mean that I will not speak for Rachel. I am assuming, but I certainly mean that in an endearing way, in like a fun. It's going to be wild, and it might be terrible. But what if it's not?
What if it's not? That's what I love to hear. I'm also curious about your thoughts with the Ottawa charge.
Oh, Ottawa. You know that I absolutely adore Katarzyna Mrazova, and always will. There's not anything, I think, at this point that could make me stray from that. I love her game. I think it's criminally underrated. So all of that to say, Rachel, do I think they made the right picks here? Yeah, I do. I mean, I do. I just had to say what I had to say about Katarzyna. And I think injury has certainly been a part of it, but I think, she's had difficulty getting into a good stride here. I don't think that this, for me, is indicative that Ottawa wants to move on from her if they don't have to. But I do think this is first of all, can we state the obvious? Phillips was going to be on this list, right? I mean, we all
100%,
knew that, right?
100%.
We knew that. We knew that. Now, here's where things get sticky, right? When it comes to Ottawa. Again, I like this list, and I do think people will notice that there is no Brianne Jenner.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is like if you're making a decision to do one of each position, this is the correct list. I think, Savalainen, I think the intangibles are there too.
Yeah.
And I hate using that word a lot, but when you look at clutch moments for this team, Savalainen was there every single time.
100%. Yep. And that's why knowing that clutch moments, knowing that a cool, steady hand is historically what this organization has needed, I'm fine with this pick.
Yeah. The only question mark I have on that front is from a recency bias. Mm-hmm. You could make an argument for Kadyrova as well.
Yeah. That's very true.
But again, if you're looking for goalie, forward, defender, like this is the right approach if that's what your plan is here. And I think with Ottawa, that's the right way to go. I do think, again, they have a more scoring by committee look, except for Brianne Jenner, obviously.
Yeah.
And they already protected Rebecca Leslie. So there's your top two scorers on your team, right?
Yeah.
So I think that, Brianne Jenner is the only one where you're like, maybe.
I mean, yeah, Rebecca Leslie, love that pick. I really just can't love her enough. Yes. I don't think there's a single soul that follows women's hockey that thought that Phillips wasn't going to be on this list. Now, here's the thing that's interesting, and I wonder this about Brianne Jenner. It is not. This is not reporting. This is more like sharing some, an open hypothesis here. Is Brianne Jenner the type of player you think, Rachel, who will maybe signal that they plan and intend to stay in one place? You know what? You know who's a better example to not put this all on Brianne Jenner in Ottawa? Do we really think that Natalie Spooner is going anywhere?
And Natalie Spooner has earned the right to determine where she is. That's the thing.
And I do think Jenner might have a lot of the same qualities in that respect when it comes to work put in this season, seasons past, within the history of hockey, and then also knowing that there are family dynamics that are important to these players that they have been on record talking about. So and they can still play at an elite level. But again, I Natalie Spooner for sure, I think has pretty much signaled and made it clear that Toronto is home, right? And so if there's a team in Toronto, Natalie Spooner, and if Natalie Spooner is playing, that's where Natalie Spooner will be.
Or, maybe Hamilton. I don't know. But
maybe Hamilton now. That's right, because it's right there. Maybe Hamilton now. But I do wonder if so why do I bring this up when it comes to Ottawa and maybe a little bit Jenner? Because if that's something that's widely known, here's what you can give your kind of home discount or kind of make that work in your favor. Then your team won't protect you because they know that these players now have some autonomy, right? And so they can be made an offer, but they do not have to accept it, Rachel.
Right. And that's the thing. And and Brianne Jenner's married and has a life, and
that's what I'm saying. Like settling,
that'll factor into it for sure.
100%. And as you again have earned the right with your play, but also at the stage of the career and kind of like what turns life. I think of Brianna Stewart from the New York Liberty. The New York Liberty, I knew they weren't going to protect Brianna Stewart because I knew, and everyone else did, Brianna Stewart was like, listen, I can on my own time tell people that I'm not leaving. And it's not considered collusion or anything if an athlete is like, this is my home and I want to stay. Because certain players, when they say that is the gospel truth, right? Don't bother trying to get me in an expansion draft because I'm going to decline the offer. I'm staying where I'm staying, right? So I think that's going to be interesting to see if like we heard Brianna Stewart do, like we heard Sabrina Ionescu do in the WNBA, if certain players kind of signal that wherever Toronto, Ottawa, Vancouver is home, and that's where they're staying. And then that gives their team a little bit of leeway because it's a signal to other teams, don't sign me, basically. Which comes to something else, a topic, Rachel, that we wanted to talk about when it comes to disclosure. I am interested if we'll see players start signaling where they are or are not going to go. Probably more so keep it on the positive side, like I'm staying here. But salary disclosure. First of all, when I heard that news while we were away for a week, I was super excited. I have wanted to see more transparency, even if the numbers are super low, because then you can track growth in a different way. You can track over time as an athlete, the value. So yeah, it's like, okay, this is my lump sum, but look at that as a percentage of what was available. And there you go. That can show a track record of value. But what it also does is I think it helps reset the market if the value perhaps isn't where it needs to be, Rachel. So when we heard that the players decided to release the salaries from what would be the 2025-26 season, right, Rachel? When they all decided to do that and every player's salary was unveiled, you could, even as analysts, right? We were like, I mean, there's certain players that if I look at the raw number, I'm like, there's no way Britta Curl-Salemi is making the amount of money that she's making. I was very shocked with that, given how I think I would value her in the league from a hockey perspective. I mean, I'm just going to keep it honest. From a hockey perspective, I thought that number was low. And I think another thing that we saw as a part of this conversation, Rachel, is that people are still a little bit dismayed. They're a little bit frustrated that the numbers overall are so low. And maybe why players who their value should be higher, there's just not much. You can't go any higher and still try to fill a complete roster.
Well, and, we talked a bunch about goaltenders, right? So you have the aforementioned Kaylee Osborne, who basically was the New York Sirens in a lot of ways this season, just a hair above league minimum at $36,500. Reagan Kirk, who probably just renegotiated a much, much better deal and became one of those 3 protected players for Toronto, was at league minimum. That blows my mind that the two top goaltenders for the existing 8 teams were at league minimum. That's part of it. Jesse Eldridge and Haley Wynn being barely above minimum, like craziness.
Yeah, these are crazy deals. And again, these numbers are based on a few different things, including just the constraints. Like certain players that are signed at a certain level are guaranteed a certain amount. And again, how much does that play into, okay, we need this player and we want to pay this player because of the value they offer on the ice, but then in the market. But then that means that you have someone that is extremely important to what you're doing on the ice, and maybe for some extremely important. I think of a Carly Jackson is someone who is extremely important to what the league, and in this case Seattle, is trying to do in pulling in, right, a certain fan base and engaging them. them. But what is the value that's set on those things? And so overall, and Kara Mori addressed this, and I agree. We had Madison Packer on the We Need to Talk Now podcast, and Madison Packer agreed that the transparency here, Rachel, is going to be player friendly in the long run. And I'm all about that. Now how players utilize that alongside their agents, that's also going to be interesting. But in theory, having that transparency will help make a stronger case for the players as they're negotiating, individual salaries, but also as the Players Association is looking towards the future in what the next collective bargaining agreement should look like.
Right. And it's interesting to see whether management versus the players are going to be able to weaponize this transparency and who will be able to do it more effectively. Because if you have the Players Association just saying, hey, salaries are going to, let's just say they decide salaries are going to be public at the time of signing, right? Versus this one-time dump at the end of the year.
Yeah. And sorry, let's talk a little bit about that. Like, explain that just real quick, because I think it's an important differentiation that, yes, we have the 2025-26 salaries, but we have 3 protected players from every single team, including some contracts that were renegotiated, like players were re-signed, and not a single dollar amount was disclosed. Correct.
So we don't know how much Reagan Kirk's price went up, right? We don't.
If it did, right.
So I think, if it did, I would certainly hope it did.
You would hope, especially if they're picked at this stage. But again, we don't know because we don't have the numbers.
Right. And especially this early in the process and such a tumultuous expansion process, there's a way for management to weaponize keeping these numbers secret, in the fact that if a player says, or management says, I will pay you a little bit more if you keep the number to yourself, like in kind of a side deal about it.
I honestly didn't even think about that in the context of this league, because again, we had gotten the transparency on the back end of the 25-26 season, but you're right. And as we started talking about this, even before we started recording, I was like, oh yeah, like if we go
because that helps them in their future negotiations for other players. I mean, I understand the PA has these numbers and they do share them with each other behind the scenes as a players association, but in terms of negotiation and what the public is seeing
which matters.
Right, in terms of the public opinion and pressure and pushback, right, on any of these signings, if the numbers come out immediately versus a year from now, that's very different. And if a team wants to overpay a player for no transparency or underpay a player, and they're not going to feel any pressure about it until a year from now, and we still don't even, and that's even a question mark. Like, where's the incentive to get these numbers up?
The more I think about this now, the more fascinated I am, because, I had a conversation with
many options.
I had a conversation with Madison Packer, as I mentioned, on We Need to Talk Now. And at the time that she was playing in the previous league, I believe this was when it was called the Premier Hockey Federation, she opted to disclose her salary and the percentage of the rev share that she was entitled to, because she believed in salary disclosure. Now we have a situation where eventually, hopefully, this is an ongoing thing, right? Where salaries will be disclosed, but will players, perhaps for their own gain or just because of what they want to see in the league, specifically through the PA, will they start saying their salaries more openly? Like, I think of Haley Skamura, right? Wins with the Montreal Victoire, someone you were super early on the pod to rightfully call out during the playoffs. But something that I thought was really interesting is, I forget the name of the podcast, so forgive me in the moment, but she went on a show and was talking and was very transparent with the numbers and the stipends that she gets from USA Hockey and how salaries have changed over her professional career. And I thought that was interesting because Haley Skamura did that weeks before we knew the Players Association was ultimately going to release all of the salaries. And so are there going to be
more she's on the low end, by the way. Like, crazy to me. Crazy.
Wild. Wild. Yes. Also egregiously low is Haley Scamura. But are we going to see other players go the Haley Scamura, or for some OG fans, the Madison Packer route, and disclose their salaries and other things to give a more full and complete picture of the women's hockey landscape? I personally am here for it because, again, I think that if we look at the wave that's happening in women's sports and investment in women's sports, and the revenue coming from women's sports, this salary disclosure, whether it's agreed upon on by the league, or the players and the Players Association, whether players start doing it on their own, but ideally, Rachel, and also it being disclosed when they sign, but ideally it's not one of those things or two, and then we leave one. Hopefully, ideally, it's all of them, right? Because whether it's an entry-level contract, a first-round draft pick, a 10-year veteran, Rachel, anytime we get a press release about an NHL team, we are guaranteed to know if it's a trade, if it's a signing, if it's a re-signing, that we're going to have the year and the term, right? And it's also going to be broken down AAV for us. That is, when you get a press release about a roster move, we know that information is going to be official when we get that press release. It's not like a to be determined later thing. It is right? Stock. That is the stock email that is sent. You fill in the details and you hit send. We are not there when it comes to women's sports, period. And there's more money coming into women's sports than we've ever seen before. And my gut is telling me, Rachel, that especially with some of the leadership that we've seen come onto the Players Association side in all women's leagues, and with the Players Association, is that women athletes are seeing the value in having that transparency and having those numbers be more a part of the conversation, even as those numbers are egregiously low at the time.
Yeah, it is, I think, the story here when all is said and done. And this expansion process, I think, could highlight some of that. And the fact that there's so many more players. And, you know, as we've talked about many, many times, this league being under single ownership, like, will that, like, in effect, limit the rate at which these salaries could increase?
And yeah, because I have so many
because the power is on ownership.
I have so many questions. You're right, because and this goes back to conversations that we've had even before we officially launched at Even Strength, Rachel. Read through that collective bargaining agreement. Do not recall, a lot of holes, and do not recall seeing and have asked and have not heard that there is an opt-out for that CBA. And why do I think an opt-out for players, and the league for that matter, is important? Because you sign, in most leagues, you're signing multi-year broadcast deals, sponsorship deals, all of these things. So you're locked into a certain price effectively, right? With some fluctuation depending on other variances and things like ticket sales and, you know, attendance and merchandise and stuff like that. But those numbers are locked in, right? And so that's what you're operating off of. That's how you're figuring things out. But if all of those other numbers are skyrocketing or plummeting for that matter, don't you think that should probably impact how players are paid or how spending happens at the league level? And again, when you lock players into that, then they have to wait anywhere from 8 to 10 years, Rachel, to capitalize on the growth trajectory that's happening right now. What's gonna, like, that's really tough to feel like you have to wait an entire decade for the players to be able to start benefiting from the numbers they're helping drive on the revenue side.
Yeah, that's part of it too, right? Because the current CBA goes through 2031, I believe.
Think so. Something like that. 31, around there. Yeah.
So that's a long time. And for the bulk of expansion to take place, like
early
during this, like, I think this is when the players should have more options to wield any power that they have, because this is when the salary structures are going to get more or less locked in to whatever pay scale and whatever, annual cost of living increase kind of style, look at it, and the salary caps and all of that. Like, a lot of power on the league side here.
Yeah. And I think it is fair to note, and I don't recall the numbers off of the top of my head, but there is, they've allotted and determined percentages that the salary cap and things of that nature go up. So they did put that in the first collective bargaining agreement. So they did make a little bit of a cushion for just natural growth on some of the things that we mentioned from revenue and things of that nature. So I do want to just state that, because it is there, and it's great that it's there, but is it appropriate? Does it fit within the context of which we're seeing the league scale? Because 3% of a 250% increase as compared to 20%, or 50%. Those are massive differences, right? In structure. And it's the conversation that I think we see happening in the basketball space. Should all leagues get 50% of the revenue that they are specifically helping drive? Should that be an equitable split between the Players Association and the ownership group? Or is it fair, air quotes, to have the risk be effectively accounted for on the player side, but not on the league side, so those are all things. But again, when you have more numbers, hard numbers to deal with, Rachel, and data points, we can have these kinds of conversations. But yeah, I think it's interesting that there was the 25-26 salaries that were disclosed. We have not seen any salary numbers come with the players that have been signed. And will that continue? Where does the tipping point happen there? How many players on their own start having those conversations? And again, you mentioned this, but just want to mention it again. Yes, we do know that it's been at least now going on, I guess, 3 seasons where players have access to that information. I don't remember hold on, let me think about this, Rachel. I don't remember off of the top of my head, so I want to ask you if you do. Did they have that disclosure in the inaugural season? As I recall, they did not, but by season 2, we got word that players had access to all of the salaries. That's my recollection.
That is mine as well. I can't say 100%, but that is my recollection.
Right. I think that's what it was. We will fact check that for the next show, because that's how I recall it. And I'm trying to decide in my mind if that's just when we as media learned that, or was it a thing that we learned about it because it just got enacted? You know what I'm saying? So we'll go back to that and go back to the CBA, because I want to get that accurate. I think it's important. But this is the other side of the PWHL that we try to mention in these conversations. There's exponential growth. There's so many things that are so much better in the PWHL than they were under any of the leagues prior. And honestly, sometimes what we got used to expecting at the international level. The broadcast comes to mind. The quality alone, it just no more fisheye angles, and things of that nature. If you know. And the rapid growth and the short timeline to on-ramp the PWHL, when it comes to these details, I still have questions. And I think they're valid questions to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will continue to ask them and talk about them.
Yeah, exactly. Because, it impacts the ecosystem, especially because we're seeing so much rapid growth in this specific league. And the indication is that because the PWHL is a part of women's sports, that it is going to enjoy the trajectory, that growth trajectory that is expected not even plateau until 2030 at the earliest, Rachel. When you look at some of, the growth numbers that we've seen across women's sports. So All of that to be determined. We got into a lot on today's episode, and it was kind of it was like we had a way of wanting to structure it, and then you realize that they all relate to one another. So we did our best to, at a high level, talk about first the players that were protected, some of the moves at the coaching level that happened, and how that impacts how then the teams go from their protected list to building out their full rosters. And of course, the salary disclosure there, we wanted to get into that, what we like about it, and the questions that we have, given that the disclosure seemed to stop at the 25-26 numbers and did not carry over into some of the signings that were announced in phase 1. Well, Rachel, we've got several other phases to come through here, including
phase 2. Let's go.
Phase 2, by the time we release this episode, will be in full swing here. We also, of course, have the draft. Things get started on the media side and just everyone coming to town and stuff on the 16th. So, we're talking less than 2 weeks away. We want to break down, of course, all of the news as we get it here, Rachel. But before actually we leave, let's do this, because again, we have phase 1, we have the protected players. The next phase, though, is going to be phase 2. And that is the player distribution process that will take place, again, starting today, June 5th. Phase 2 starts the day that we're recording, June 5th, and goes through June 8th. Each expansion team will be building its foundation. They have 5 players through this signing process in phase 2. And as you alluded to, in the next phase, they also will continue to fill out the roster. But that's what's coming up between now and our next show is going to be phase 2. And so it's the 4 expansion teams, Hamilton, San Jose, Las Vegas, and Detroit, that will be announcing the players that they pick in phase 2. So make sure, if you're not already, that you are following Black Rosie Media. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have a playlist at Even Strength. You'll see it on the end credits. You can click that. Make sure you're locked in there. Set your notifications so you know when we have an episode. We, of course, love our audio-only friends, and we house our show through Transistors. You can find all of the At Even Strength episodes there. You can look at the link in the show notes for that, but also you can find us on most audio platforms. Before Rachel Donner, Erica L. Ayala, we went through a lot of stuff in this very packed episode of At Even Strength, but we'll be talking about phase 2 and getting you ready for the PWHL draft on our next episode. We'll record on Friday and have that ready for you Saturday morning. Until then, peace out, everybody.